This video is sponsored by Triton Tools.
So we've had this slice of tree kicking around in the garden for years now, and it was most likely destined to be chopped up for firewood.
However, as you've hopefully realised by now, we love nothing more than taking old rubbish and turning it into something beautiful.
This has definitely seen better days. There are a number of cracks to sort out and some significant water damage as well.
Well, crack, schmack, and water damage, schmorter damage. We've already got a plan to combat both, and of course it includes a little bit of recycled plastic.
The first thing to tackle was the lopsidedness of the cookie. One side was clearly more chunky than the other, so we used a straight-ish line and used our questionable chainsaw skills to even it up.
This was a little tricky to hold, but we managed to wedge it in place using some long beams clamped in our Triton multi-stands.
That got it much closer to a flat surface, but we didn't need it to be perfect because next up we were going to use our router sled to get it completely flat.
Once we'd got it nice and levelled on the table and taken a few sweet slab shots for the gram, we set up our router sled.
The router sled is basically a giant jig that holds the router above the surface of the wood so you can pass it back and forth to flatten the entire surface.
We used the biggest bit that we had, which was 1¼ inches, as this would reduce the amount of passes we had to take over the wood.
After 3 passes, lowering the bit each time, we finally had a nice flat surface, so all we had to do was to flip it over and do the same on the other side.
The router does leave track lines in the surface which need to be sanded out.
Since this is a cookie, it means that the top and bottom surfaces are both end grain, which makes it super hard and takes ages to sand.
For that reason, we started off with our belt sander with an 80 grit belt, as this is the most aggressive and is therefore the quickest.
Once the lines were gone, we switched over to one of our favourite Triton tools, the Geos, and we worked through the grits all the way up to 240.
While I worked on the top, Matt used a quarter sheet palm sander to tidy up that rough edge.
Now that it's sanded, the area that has the water damage is much more visible. And although it means it's not a perfect cookie, we actually quite like it and think it adds a lot of character.
Before we continued, we wanted to make sure that area was completely stabilised, so we used some rot hardener across the whole piece.
Once the water damage had been sorted, we wanted to tackle the cracks. After all of the sanding, only one of these was significant enough to worry about, so we thought we'd add a couple of recycled plastic bow ties to stop this spreading any further.
A popular solution for this that we see a lot of people doing is to fill the cracks with resin.
And whilst this does look great, we don't really like working with resin because it's not a very sustainable material and it inherently creates a lot of waste that simply cannot be reused.
So we're using our tried and tested DIY plastic recycling method, as this is a much more eco-friendly option and still gives that really nice colour contrast.
And if you've not seen us do this before, then we're using Panini presses to melt Hdpe plastic such as milk bottle tops and shampoo bottles. Pretty much any plastic with the number 2 inside the Mobius loop will work with this method.
Once all of the plastic was melted, we can twist and fold it to create a really nice marble pattern. We could then chuck it into our homemade plywood mould before adding some pressure in our press.
We let this cool overnight, which left us with a brand new slab of plastic with just a few lumps and bumps.
We knocked off all of those high spots using a chisel before running it through our thickness planer to get it completely flat.
We find if you take lots of small passes with the thicknesser, you can actually achieve a fantastic finish straight off the machine.
The thicknesser does create a lot of waste, but the great thing about working with recycled plastic is the fact that you can reuse it all again in a future project. In our workshop we use a completely different dust extractor when working with Hdpe, as that means we can collect it all really easily.
We made a couple of cardboard templates to test the size of the bow ties that we wanted, and once we were happy, we traced this onto the plastic.
We cut the shape out on our scroll saw as this is our preferred method because it creates far less waste.
And to make sure the edges were nice and straight, we tidied these up with a chisel and a card scraper.
So that's one bow tie cut. However, we have quite a nice amount of plastic here, so we figured we'd batch out a load of them so we have them for future use in other projects.
We could of course just rinse and repeat the method that we just showed you. However, if you watched our last video, you may have seen that we are now the proud owners of a CNC in our workshop.
We used our Vectric Aspire software to draw up a number of different sized bow ties and fit as many as we could onto the remaining material.
And then we fixed our plastic into the bed of our Stepcraft D840 CNC machine and let it do its thing.
Well, not quite. Instead of actually being productive and doing something else, we ended up just watching it the whole time.
Once we'd finished, we chose these two sizes to use on our cookie table, and next was the nerve-wracking moment where we had to actually cut into it.
To do this, we're going to be using one of our Triton routers. Triton tools are a long-time supporter of our channel, and we've been using their tools for years now, even before we started working with them.
Triton recently sent us their TMN RTR trim router, which is an awesome addition to their router lineup and perfect for this application.
It's a really nice piece of kit, and it's great that it comes with two different bases as standard inside that protective carry case. The first is a trim base which has this removable guide, meaning it can turn any standard bit into a bearing guided cutter.
The second, and the one we're using for this project, is the plunge base, which gives you much more control and allows you to creep up on the depth that you want nice and carefully.
It comes with both a 1/4 inch and an 8mm collet, so it fits a wide range of bits, and is also router table compatible, coming with a built-in router lift.
So if you enjoy making yourself, you should definitely consider them.
We used masking tape to help protect our tabletop from the router. Then we positioned our first bow tie exactly where we wanted it and then carefully marked around it with a sharp marking knife.
The masking tape also helps to give a nice contrast to show the area that needs to be cut.
We used a straight bit in the router and started to very carefully remove that material. We were taking very shallow passes at first, but once we started to build up some more confidence, we started to take away more material.
On the last pass, we cut as close to our line as we dared to go, and then used a chisel to tidy up the rest of the cut.
Once we completed the first one, we then repeated all of those same steps on the second one, which actually went much smoother because it was our second attempt.
we fixed them in place, we chamfered the bottom edge of each of the bow ties just to help them fit a little bit easier. Big shout out to our wonderful patron Dave for that tip.
Now usually bow ties are made out of wood, which means they can be nicely glued into place.
However, there's a few different reasons as to why we didn't add any adhesive to ours. Firstly, Hdpe is notorious for being hard to get it to stick to anything. We found no glues on the market that can hold this stuff down.
We've used contact adhesive in the past for larger surface areas, which works okay, but eventually it does become loose.
The other and more important reason for avoiding glue is that it makes it very difficult to recycle in the future. If two different materials are bonded together, they would need to be separated to be effectively recycled. So if we can avoid that needing to happen in the first place, then all the better.
Instead, we went for a good old friction fit, in the hope that our routing and chiselling skills were up to par.
We used a scrap of wood and a mallet to fit the bow ties, and we were very pleased that they went in first time and seemed to fit great.
We intentionally cut those slots a little bit shallow, just so we could come back and trim those bow ties flush afterwards. Now this could absolutely be done by sanding them flush, but we like to think that if you can avoid making microplastics, then you should.
Instead, we used our card scraper again to remove all that excess material. The card scraper is always our preferred method to finish plastic projects, as the fine shavings are much easier to collect and reuse than the fine dust particles.
Right, so we are going to go chuck on some legs and then show you the final result.
So there you go, that's how we turned a big lump of firewood and a handful of bottle tops into this gorgeous coffee table.
We used some really simple hairpin legs, which we screwed to the underside of the table, and then finished the whole thing with a beeswax and mineral oil mix.
We are absolutely loving how the brightly coloured bow ties pop against the wood grain, and we couldn't be happier with the fit. The little bit of heat built up from the friction on the card scraper filled all of the tiny little gaps and made us look like absolute pros.
An absolutely massive thank you goes over to Triton Tools for their continued support and for sponsoring this video. Be sure to check them out for all of your power tool needs.
And a huge thank you to our fabulous patrons. Not only do they give us tips and make us better makers, their financial support helps us to keep the machines running in the workshop. If you want to join the Brotherhood, then check the link in the description below. We'd love to have you. Thank you so much for watching.
See you on the next one.